Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest NatCen ESS City University webinar. Today we have two papers on the theme of incentives. We're going to hear first from Nicole Martin and colleagues at the University of Manchester, and then there'll be a paper from NatCen led by Eva Aizpurua. So there'll be about 20 minutes for each talk, and then we will take questions in a single block after both papers have been concluded. So if you'd like to leave a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will scan the questions and get to those when both talks have concluded. Thanks very much. So without further ado, I'll now give the floor to Nicole Martin from the University of Manchester.
Hiya, so thank you very much for the invitation to talk about the incentives and what we learned from running the Ethnic Minority British Election Study pilot. So this study was, the fieldwork was done in 2021, so it's quite distant in some ways from now, but hopefully, well, we've certainly learned things from the experience. I hope to share this with you. So this is joint work with Alex Bogdan from Ipsos and the rest of the Ethnic Minority British Election Study pilot team. You can see the authors there. I'm going to introduce the study background. So what is the Ethnic Minority British Election Study pilot, and why should you care about it? And then I'm going to explain the problems we were trying to solve and how we tried to solve them, including how we varied our incentives. And then we're going to explain what we learned from this process and kind of our recommendations from any future studies. So the Ethnic Minority British Election Study is based on the main British election study. So the main British election study has been running since, I think, 1964. And I believe this makes it the longest running social survey in Britain. So it happens after every UK general election, runs only in Britain though, Great Britain. And the aim of it is to essentially better understand the election results and to understand why voters bother voting in the first place and why they make particular choices at the ballot box each time. It also provides a really useful way of looking at how political and social attitudes have changed over time. It's a really long-running survey. And so the way they do this, they have many elements currently, but every British election study has had a high quality probability sample of the British population aged 18 plus. And there are a few thousand respondents in each wave. So this kind of maximizes the quality and the representativeness of the survey, which is kind of core to their mission. But as you'll know, with a sample size of a few thousand people, it's not really of a sufficient size to kind of give reliable estimates for ethnic minority participants. And we might care about this because ethnic minority voters or electors are about 11% of the population that's eligible to vote in UK general elections, and about 10% of those registered. So this is a kind of reasonably important group, but not adequately covered by this the main British election study. So enter the Ethnic Minority British Election Study, and the clues in the name. The aim of this study is to kind of rectify this gap and to better understand the political attitudes and behaviours of the main established ethnic minority groups in Britain. So it targets people and wants to get the views of people for Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Chinese, Black Caribbean, Black African, and mixed ethnic backgrounds in the UK. The reason that we might want to care about this is you need a kind of high quality probability sample to say useful things about rates of electoral registration and rates of turnout, and these are very policy relevant questions. So the first Ethnic Minority British Election Study ran in 1997. This is about 700 people, and it was a boost to the main British election study. In 2010, there was a bespoke, distinct survey that was commissioned instead. So this was much larger. There are about 2,700 interviews in this study. and it had a kind of common core with the British election study, the main British election study. About 50% of the content was repeated across the two post-election face-to-face surveys. But about half of it was unique to the ethnic minority British election study, asking about different questions and different issues from the main study. Mirroring the data collection used by the main BES at the time, this was face-to-face. And one of the things that makes this hard to do, and it's kind of a significant thing that the British election study doesn't have to do, is to screen households for eligible participants. And this is quite an extensive process. So the 2010 EMBES study, as I said, about 2,700 interviews. But to get that many people, they had to screen over 30,000 addresses. So this is, and by screen, I mean someone goes to the house for multiple times to try to carry out the screening from people in the household. So this is really a huge part of the fieldwork process and what kind of makes running EMBES different from running the main British election study. So following the general election in December 2019, the main British election study was taking place as usual, a probability sample, face-to-face interviews, going to houses, asking people to take part. And then, of course, you know what happened in spring 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic happened. And so as a result, they moved to, midway through fieldwork, they moved to a mixed mode push-to-web approach because face-to-face interviewing was obviously suspended. And they were quite surprised by the kind of high, relatively successful, by the success of this approach. And so given the collaboration between the British election study and the ethnic minority British election study teams historically, this kind of raised the question of, well, could we use this push-to-web data collection for a future ethnic minority British election study? So we put this proposal, this is what we proposed to do. And so we had this two-stage approach to recruitment. Remember, the thing that sets apart the ethnic minority British election study EMBES from the main British election study is this screening component. And so we had to work out how to do this screening component in a push-to-web setting. So based on the previous push-to-web surveys and the BES push-to-web response rate, about 33%, we assumed that about 30% of the households would respond to part one of our survey. So we set this up as part one of the survey was, we call it the screener, but it's part 1 to respondents. People were answered 5 questions. And then depending on their answers to that online, they were screened into or out of the survey, and if they were from a qualifying ethnic minority group, they were screened into the much longer survey, and that's part 2 of the survey. So we assumed that about 30% of households that we contacted and invited to take part would respond to part 1. And we also assumed, based on our estimates of the population, that around half of those responding would be from a qualifying ethnic minority group. And so if we put these numbers to with our addresses in our sampling frame, we assumed we'd get around 500 interviews from 3,500 addresses that we sampled. And the important things that we need to know about sampling was that we based it on LSOAs. We assigned each LSOA an ethnic minority density based on 2011 census data, and we only sampling for this study in areas where 20% or more of the population belonged to one of the main established ethnic minority groups. And that's how we arrived at our first sample. So what did we do? We sampled these addresses only in areas where 20% or more of the people living there from one of these ethnic minority groups. And of each of these addresses received 1 invitation letter that asked them to participate in the survey and up to 3 reminder letters. When we say they were asked to take part in the survey, following the push-to-web fieldwork of the main British election study, there was a letter and they were invited to go to a website to fill in the survey. So the person in the household with the next birthday was invited to take part in the survey, and they were told this survey had 2 parts. So part one was something that everyone was invited to take part in. What we knew is that they were going to be screened based on their ethnicity. They didn't know this. So they were told they could take part in part one, and they would get £5 if they took part in this. And then they were told they may be invited to take part in part two of the survey. So if the respondent answered part one and they were from an ethnic minority group, they were screened into part two of the survey. And then if they did this, they would receive £20 for part two and £5 for part one. If they chose not to complete part two, of course, they were screened out, and they would receive only £5 for part one. So we thought this was quite a neat way of kind of outsourcing the burden of screening a household onto respondents themselves. So I've told you about the incentives difference between part one and part two. So it was always £5 for part one and £25 for the two of them together from the invitation and first reminder. And then following what the main British election study had done, we were just replicating their design with this screener difference. We increased the incentives to encourage people to complete who hadn't yet completed. So we thought this was really smart. But during the fieldwork with this original sample of 3,500 addresses, we learned that it wasn't that smart. So we received far fewer responses than we had expected. And this meant essentially that we hadn't used up our budget for the incentives. And so we decided that we wanted to test whether this split incentive structure was putting people off. So the meaningful comparison for us was where the British election study response rates were at the same point in fieldwork, and we were getting much fewer responses. We then drew a new boost sample from the same sampling frame, so from the same set of LSOAs, where at least 20% of the population from ethnic minority group. But we only had time to send them one invitation letter, so we weren't able to provide the reminder letters. And we screened and we removed the screening and just invited people to take part in the survey about Britain in 2021, for which they would be given a £25 incentive. So we stopped screening people out, just gave everyone the same incentive, and made it a bit simpler. So this is what we did. If you're in the boost sample, you get one invitation letter, and regardless of who you are, you were screened in at the end of part one into part two. So you have to do the same online questionnaire, but there's no there was no screening element. Didn't change whether you were routed in and out of taking the survey. And if you completed the survey, you got £25 as a voucher as your incentive. So what did we learn from this? Well, let's look firstly. We evaluate this. I think the two key figures that we care about are the response rates. So how many people of those that we contacted did we get a completed interview from, or completed online survey from? And secondly, given the aim of the survey was to survey the views of ethnic minority respondents, what proportion of interviews were from ethnic minorities? So if we compare the kind of final response rates, you can see that in the original design, where we had anticipated a response rate of 30%, we achieved far below that, 19 or 20%. And the boost survey was much lower than this again, but that's because the boost survey didn't have the reminder letters. And then the other thing that we might care about is the proportion of completed interviews from ethnic minorities, the bottom line on the bottom table. So you can see in the original survey, of those people who responded, 34% were from one of the ethnic minority groups that we were interested in targeting. Compared to the boost survey, this was a slightly higher proportion of 37%. I think the thing to remember, though, is that our estimates told us that 50% of those completing the survey should be from one of these groups. So we're still far below what our estimates of the responding population would be like. We might want to make this more comparable between the original design with the split incentives and the boost design with the flat incentive, £25 for flat incentive for everyone. And so we look only at the response rate and the responses that received after the initial invitation letter, because that's all that the boost sample got. So we can discard the responses from the original that came after the original mail out. And this suggests to us perhaps that our boost approach without the two-part incentives was slightly more successful. So we have a slightly higher survey response rate, and we have slightly more responses from ethnic minorities, although these are quite small differences in the grand scheme of things. So I think our message from this is that the incentive, the kind of the screening, the self-screening design that we thought might work appears to have put off some respondents from taking part, but also perhaps disproportionately put off. It reduced the proportion of interviews from our target group, which in this study were ethnic minority respondents. So we had anticipated this 30% response rate based on the British Election Studies experience with Push-to-Web. But it might be that this expectation was too optimistic. The main British election study, of course, covers a much wider proportion of the country. And so the areas that we were sending our invitation letters to might be systematically different. For one thing, they're more likely to be, they're more heavily in London, and they're also more deprived. Or there might be some other reasons that there are low response rates in these areas. And so the kind of second bit of analysis that we did was to kind of dig into, well, if our expectation of this response rate was wrong, could we see this in the main British election study fieldwork? So these tables show you, compare the survey response rate in the main British election study, so not the ethnic minority British election study, but we compare areas of high ethnic minority density, so where at least 20% of ethnic minority residents are, where at least 20% of the residents are from ethnic minority backgrounds, with other areas. And these tables include all fieldwork, so including the kind of mixed face-to-face network that was already underway or completed by the time pandemic started, and Push-to-Web, and also Push-to-Web only. And we can see that in the areas that we were sampling for the ethnic minority British election study pilot, the response rate was lower in the main British election study overall, 34% compared to 46%, and the proportion of completed interviews with ethnic minorities, which we thought should be 50%, was much lower. But we further compared the kind of, if we look at the British election study Push-to-Web fieldwork that started during the pandemic, with the mixed fieldwork that started before the pandemic, this wasn't a randomized allocation, but we can compare it anyway. I think the differences that I want to draw your attention to are in the bottom. So we can look at the response rate and the proportion of interviews from ethnic minorities in areas of Push-to-Web compared to mixed fieldwork, and look at the difference in high density areas, so EMBES eligible areas, with other areas. So we can see that the differences in response rates between high and low density areas is greater in Push-to-Web. So there was always a difference in the response rate in areas that were eligible for EMBES with many ethnic minority residents. But this difference is bigger, 15 percentage points in Push-to-Web fieldwork only. Secondly, we can see that in areas where there are more ethnic minority residents, where we expect 50% of our respondents to come from ethnic minority backgrounds, there are always more respondents with ethnic minority backgrounds in areas when these areas are sampled, but this gap is much bigger in mixed fieldwork. So this suggests to us that in Push-to-Web, not only do we have a lower response rate, but we're also getting fewer responses from ethnic minority residents in these areas from other residents. And the final thing I would say about this kind of comparison with the British election study is that it turned out that the Push-to-Web fieldwork of the main BES included lots of areas in London, so there's actually much more of an overlap between our the EMBES sampling frame and the main British election study Push-to-Web fieldwork than you would expect by chance. But this also kind of suggests that the main BES would have hoped to recruit more ethnic minority respondents in those areas than they did. So I think, what did we learn from this exercise? So I think we learned that this screener self-screening or part 1, part 2 different incentives approach was not very successful for the purposes for which we were trying to use it. We think that this kind of standardized incentive approach that we used in the boost sample, where everyone was offered the same incentive to complete the survey, it's achieved a slightly higher response rate and achieved slightly more responses from ethnic minorities living in these areas who were the target population of this survey. But the kind of balancing question here is, well, if you give everyone an incentive, but you're only interested in the views of a subset of the population, firstly, what are the ethics of collecting data that you don't need? But secondly, is this actually cheaper than screening households face-to-face or using some other technique that doesn't involve paying incentives for interviews that you don't want to know the answers to? We also think that we've shown, at least for users of the British election study, that push-to-web data collection in high-density ethnic minority areas yields a weaker response rate than for the general population. So it might be that these areas are more deprived, and we know that response rates are lower in areas of high deprivation. It might be that ethnic minorities are less likely to respond to social research in general. Or it may also be that ethnic minorities may be less likely to respond to push-to-web invitations in particular. If you don't want to use this push-to-web method and these incentives for this purpose, then those are the things that we think we've learned from this exercise. And finally, the 50% conversion rate was far too ambitious. We don't think that our population estimates were wildly wrong, so it might be that they were based on a whole population rather than the voting age population. But they were also based on 2011 census data, which is a fair bit out of date. So it's not unclear which way these biases would go. But I think my working assumption is that there were people who were eligible for our survey who didn't respond to it, more so than we vastly overestimated the ethnic diversity of London. So our recommendations for a future study, if you want to achieve a sample of ethnic minority respondents using Push-to-Web, you need to mail lots and lots of people. And I think number 4 is the other important one to draw attention to in this forum where we're discussing incentives. I think we can say that this 2-part incentive deterred some respondents. So we'll have to any future study that wants to use this kind of self-screening approach will have to think about how that might work with the target population that you're interested in. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions later.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Yes, some really tricky problems there, I can see. Excellent paper. Can I just remind everybody that if you've got a question, please park it for now and place it in the Q&A, and we will come back to all the questions after the second presentation, and I will screen the questions out into the relevant papers. So we now move on to our second paper for today, which is from NatCen. So Eva, I give the floor over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm excited to share the results from an incentive experiment embedded in the National Travel Attitude Study. But before I get started, I would like to acknowledge everyone who made this study possible. This includes the Department for Transport, who commissioned this piece of research, my colleagues at NatCen, especially Shane Howe, who is the lead researcher on the project, and of course, the respondents who contributed their time to this research. In terms of today's outline, I'll start by providing a little bit of background about the National Travel Attitude Study, or NTAS, and highlight the rationale for experimenting with incentives. I'll then cover our hypothesis, describe the methodology, and share some of the key findings. And I'll wrap up with the study's limitations and some suggestions for future research. For those of you who might not be familiar, the NTAS was launched in 2019 to measure transport attitudes in England. This study replaced some modules of the British Social Attitudes Survey, which previously covered this topic. The NTAS is fielded twice a year and uses a push-to-web design that includes web and telephone interviewing. By sampling from the National Travel Survey sample and linking NTAS data with NTS, it provides extensive insights into transport attitudes and transport behaviors while limiting respondent burden. In terms of the population, the NTAS targets individuals 16 and over living in England who've taken part in the NTS and consented to participate in future research. They are contacted using multiple modes, including mail, email, and SMS, and followed by telephone. Our standard incentive is a £5 shopping voucher conditional upon participation, and response rates are relatively high, ranging from 43% to 52% across waves. If anyone is interested and would like to learn more about the study, there are dedicated websites that I've linked here, and the data can be accessed for non-commercial purposes through the UK Data Archive. So why experimenting with incentives? As many of you know, in the last few decades, survey research has faced great challenges with declines in response rates. And incentives have become a key tool to mitigate this trend and encourage participation. Theories like the benefit cost and leverage salience suggest that incentives work by changing how people weigh the pros and the cons of participation. So by offering something in exchange, they can make participation more appealing. Social exchange theory also suggests that incentives can trigger norms of reciprocity. So by receiving a token of appreciation, individuals might feel a sense of obligation to reciprocate by participating in the study. In terms of the findings from the literature, what we know is that a growing body of research indicates that incentives have a small to moderate positive effects on response rates. They can also lower fieldwork efforts, and in doing so, they can reduce cost. However, the effectiveness of incentives varies depending on multiple factors. For example, monetary incentives tend to outperform vouchers or lotteries. Similarly, prepaid incentives that are provided in advance tend to be more effective than promise incentives that are offered after completion. When it comes to incentive amounts, more can be helpful, but there are often diminishing returns. And what this means is that doubling an incentive doesn't necessarily double the response rates. And response rates are important because low response can lead to response bias. This happens when respondents' characteristics differ from those of non-respondents, and this reduces the ability of our surveys to represent the population. Incentives can increase response from specific groups, and in doing so, they can amplify or they can reduce existing biases. In the best scenario, they would help us attract underrepresented populations. And this aligns with the leverage salience theory, which argues that individuals consider multiple factors when deciding whether to participate in surveys. For some, especially for those for whom money is an important motivator, incentives can increase the perceived benefit of participation. And while theory suggests that incentives can affect response bias, the evidence to date is quite mixed. However, there are some studies indicating that incentives can increase responses from underrepresented groups, such as younger individuals. And the impact of incentives on data quality is also not very clear. Theoretically, data quality could be affected in two opposing ways. So on the one hand, incentives could reduce data quality by attracting less motivated respondents. These respondents might be driven by the incentive and might engage more superficially with the survey. They might engage in more satisficing behaviors. However, on the other hand, incentives could actually increase motivation and effort, as respondents might feel a sense of obligation to provide high-quality responses in exchange for the incentive. What is important to note is that empirical studies have not found a consistent effect of incentives on data quality. And also to note that in longitudinal surveys like the EMBES, incentives play a crucial role to mitigate attrition, because we know that attrition leads to a smaller and also to more selective samples. And although incentives are effective at increasing response rates, their cost efficiency can be less favorable in longitudinal settings. This happens because longitudinal participants have already agreed to be part of the study, and this makes the group that can be convinced by incentives smaller. The other thing is that over time, participants' intrinsic motivation might play a greater role in the decision to continue participating, which would also reduce the impact of incentives. Based on all this previous research that I just discussed, we tested 4 hypotheses in our study. The first one posited that higher incentives will have a positive impact on response rates. We expected the lowest response rate in the 5-pound group and the highest in the 15-pound group. And given the EMBES relatively high response rate, we expected a modest effect. With our second hypothesis, we tested whether higher incentives lead to faster survey completion. The third hypothesis proposed that incentives would produce a similar sample composition with a slightly improved representation of younger individuals in the higher incentive groups. And finally, hypothesis 4 stated that incentive amounts would have no effect on data quality. To test this hypothesis, we used data from wave 8 of the EMBES study. So, as I said, participants included individuals 16 and over who had completed the National Travel Survey and also agreed to be recontacted for future research. We compare 3 incentive amounts: 5 pounds, which is the standard incentive for NTS and for EMBES, 10 pounds and 15 pounds, and they were all conditional upon participation. The fieldwork was conducted between March and April of last year using a mixed mode approach that combined web and telephone interviews. And the topic of the study focused on perceived safety when traveling, with a focus on public transportation. To capture the impact of incentives across dimensions, we examined indicators of response, sample composition, and data quality. Response was assessed by comparing response rates, time to completion, and the proportion of web submissions across incentive treatments. Non-response bias was assessed by comparing the demographic composition of the samples with NTS benchmarks. And finally, data quality was evaluated by using multiple indicators, including non-substantive responses, validity, and internal consistency. We examine a few other indicators, but for the sake of time and because the results were quite consistent, we will focus on these three only, but please let me know if you would like to know more about the others, and we can discuss them later. So in terms of the results, in analyzing response rates, we do see a pattern where larger incentives resulted in higher response rates. So the 15-pound incentive had the highest proportion of fully productive cases at 55%, while the 5-pound incentive had the lowest at 44%, for a difference of 11 percentage points. The 15-pound group had higher productive rates than the other two groups. And the overlapping confidence intervals for the 5 and the 10-pound groups that you can see on the plot here suggest comparable performance between the 5-pound and the 10-pound groups. Regarding contact rates, our findings suggest that higher incentives can also improve survey engagement. A 26% non-contact rate was found for the 5-pound group, which decreased to 21% with the 15 incentive. Here, significant differences were only found between the highest and the lowest incentive groups. Turning to response times, we see small differences across groups. Respondents in the 15-pound group took an average of 11 days to complete the survey, only 1 day faster than the 5-pound group. So these variations were small, providing no support to our second hypothesis that higher incentives would reduce time to completion in a meaningful way. Looking at the cumulative response on the right, we see similar submission patterns across incentive groups, with boosts following reminders around days 9, 18, and 27. And although trends were similar across the three groups, the 15-pound treatment maintained the highest submission throughout the fieldwork. We can also see that after the first 10 days, this group maintained a wider gap when compared to the 5 and the 10-pound conditions. In addition to examining time to respond, we compare the proportion of web responses across conditions. And we did this because web completions are generally less expensive than telephone ones. And as you can see here, the 5-pound incentive led to the highest proportion of telephone responses at 20%. Well, the 15-pound incentive resulted in the smallest proportion of phone responses at 13%. Similar to other indicators that we've seen here today, significant differences were only found between the lowest and the highest incentive groups, with the 10-pound treatment in between the others. And while higher incentives increase response rates, they also increase cost. And this slide examines the cost implications of the three conditions for a set achieved sample of 2,000 individuals. And the 5-pound incentive basically served as our baseline with a 44% response rate. What happens is increasing the incentive to 10 pounds resulted in a 7% increase in response rate, with costs rising by 8%. The 15-pound incentive had a large response rate increase of 25% when compared to the 5-pound baseline, but with a 15% cost increase. So these figures can help inform strategic decisions. While the 15-pound incentive increases response rates, it also incurs higher costs. So the choice of incentive will ultimately depend on the project priorities and whether the goal is to maximize response, to control costs, or to find a balance between the two. So next, we examined how incentives influence the composition of the samples. And for this, we focus on key demographics such as age, sex, race, household income, and household size. Comparisons across the three groups showed no significant differences, but we did see discrepancies with the benchmark data. And to quantify these differences, what we did was we computed dissimilarity indices. And basically, values under 0.10 marked by the red line on the plot suggest good agreement between the samples and the benchmark data, while those values under 0.05 that are indicated by the blue line here are considered very good. And what we found is that for both sex and race, we found good agreement between the samples and the NTS benchmark data. However, for household size, there was an overrepresentation of smaller households and an underrepresentation of larger households of 4 members and more. And this was particularly true for the 5 and the 10-pound conditions. The 15-pound group, in contrast, fell within the good range, showing a little bit closer alignment with the benchmark. Age and household income showed the greatest dissimilarity, especially for the 5-pound group. And this materialized in the underrepresentation of younger and higher income households. It's important to note that a high D value does not necessarily lead to bias estimates because post-survey adjustments are likely to reduce these differences between the achieved samples and the population. However, we think this analysis provides helpful information about the extent to which weighting adjustments are going to be needed, so protocols with smaller dissimilarity indices are considered better. And now turning to data quality indicators, we first examine prefer not to say responses, which can be indicative of suboptimal response behavior. We focus on 13 questions which explicitly offered this response to see if the incentive amount affected the selection of this category. As shown in the plot, the incidence of prefer not to say responses was very low across the board, and we did not find significant differences across the groups. This slide now presents an analysis of convergent validity, measuring the extent to which indicators that are supposed to measure similar concepts are indeed related. And for this, we analyze correlations between the preference to walk only at specific times, avoid traveling alone in the dark, and consider lighting conditions when traveling. The findings reveal positive correlations between these items, aligning with what we expected. In addition, z-tests confirmed that these correlations were generally comparable across incentive groups, suggesting that the incentives did not impact the validity of the measures. And then we examine internal consistency, which is a measure of reliability for multi-item scales. The first scale that we looked at examined safety considerations when traveling and included 5 items measured on agree-disagree scales. Cronbach's alpha for this scale showed good consistency with no differences across the treatments. The second scale measured the likelihood of being offered help on public transport, and it included 3 items. Here, internal consistency was excellent, and once again, we found no differences across conditions. So now moving into the conclusions, what I'll do is I'll first summarize our findings on the impact of incentives on response rates. Consistent with the literature, our hypothesis that larger incentives boost response rates was supported. The 15 incentive outperformed the others, increasing completion rates by 8 to 11 percentage points. Although the 5-pound and the 10-pound groups did not differ in their effects, we saw a linear trend with the 15 incentive achieving the highest response. And I think this reinforced the value of incentives in survey participation, showing their effectiveness even in a high response environment like the NTAS. Moving to our second hypothesis regarding time to completion, we found no significant differences across the groups. Interestingly, the 15-pound incentive group resulted in a greater proportion of web responses. This highlights the value of a cost-benefit analysis, and we see that higher incentives improve response rates and also web participation, but they also increase overall cost. For this reason, if maximizing response is the objective, a higher incentive should be used. In contrast, if cost efficiency is needed for a particular project and the achieved sample sizes are large enough for the analytical needs, increasing incentives might not be as necessary. In examining our third hypothesis, we see that all incentive groups were broadly comparable in terms of their demographic compositions when looking at sex, age, race, household size, and household income. Across the board, however, there was an overrepresentation of older individuals, and this was particularly true in the 5-pound group. In terms of household income, there was an overrepresentation of lower income households with deviations from our benchmark data, but most pronounced in the 5-pound group too. And addressing our fourth hypothesis on the impact of incentive amounts on data quality, our findings align with prior research, indicating that the incentive amount does not generally affect the quality of survey responses. To me, this is a reassuring finding, suggesting that larger incentives can boost participation without compromising data quality. And as we look ahead, our research opens some interesting paths and opportunities for further research. Well, our study provided insights on conditional incentives within the NTAS panel. We believe future research is needed to assess the effectiveness of various incentive types and amounts in different survey environments. Similarly, our analysis focused on main effects, and it's quite possible that incentives impact different groups in different ways, and this would recommend subgroup analysis. And last but not least, the indirect nature of our data quality indicators definitely leaves room for improvement, and future studies could include more indirect measures if they are available. This is all we had to share with you today. Thank you so much for staying with us, and we look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you very much, Eva. So I'm now going to field some questions in the 10 minutes that remain. Some of these questions are applicable to both presentations. So I'm going to take a couple of questions related to interviewer involvement, and then I'm going to ask a question about conditionality. So firstly, just for clarification, I think, Eva, can you just confirm that in the travel study, there was no involvement of interviewers in collecting the data? This was direct contact with respondents.
So in this case, the survey was administered using web, but also telephone. So there was that interviewer involvement in terms of making the calls and collecting the data for those who have not participated via web.
But in terms of the web opportunity making its way to respondents, that was posted.
Yes, it was mail, email, and SMS. Yes.
Super. Thank you. And then to Nicole from the same questioner, Abigail. What impact do you think screening out by participants, self-screening as it were, rather than by an interviewer visit might have had on the response rate?
I think it's tricky to say, to compare a push-to-web design response rate with an interviewer-led response rate, because push-to-web seems to get fewer responses in general. But we think that this reduced our response rate, including the kind of the screener, the two-part incentive, the part 1, part 2 of the survey appeared to give us a lower response rate than a flat incentive. And I think that a person coming to your house would give a higher response rate compared to both of these. But we were doing this during the pandemic, so we were unable to do that approach.
Thanks, Nicole. Yes, I think that's the premise of the questioner as well, that doorstep persuasion, reminders, etc., would have a positive effect. Can I now move to a question about conditionality, because it's a question from Andrea, which I think is applicable to both of you, because you're both using some level of conditionality. And the question is simply, did you take into account the thought about giving unconditional incentives to respondents in order to incentivize the response? Nicole first, maybe. We didn't consider this, I think partly because we were trying to replicate the main British election study fieldwork, but that is another approach that we could do. Yeah.
Just to add to that, I don't think that was considered, but I think it's a very interesting question, because indeed research shows that unconditional incentives tend to be more effective than conditional ones. So there is definitely a lot of research, I think, there to further explore that.
Super, thank you. Next question is for Nicole. Did the Push-to-Web invite materials contain any information for participants on how to access the survey in different languages, or was English the only option for the survey?
Yes, this is a very good question. So we didn't translate the survey. I think because we were mostly interested in whether this self-screening approach could work. With the 2010 EMBES, there was translation, and there were you could also do the face-to-face interview in other languages. So if we were going to roll out a survey based on this, then we would obviously use translation, because that's applicable for some people in the target group.
Thanks, Nicole. And while you're there, another question about the initial contact. How was the incentive introduced to respondents in the initial letter? Was the 25 quid mentioned at the outset?
Yes, so as you can imagine, we spent a lot of time trying to work out how to explain this. So people were invited to take part in a survey about Britain in 2021. They were told you will receive a £5 incentive as thank you for completing part 1 of the survey. The next sentence was, you may then be invited to take the second part of the survey, which if you complete it, be a £20 voucher. So people knew that they could get £25 or up to £50 at the end if they completed both parts, but they didn't know, we didn't tell them how they could do part 2. It just was kind of, fate in the universe would tell you if you get part 1, part 2, or just part 1.
Thanks for that clarification. Next question relates to Eva's paper, and it's from Eileen. She's asking about the comparisons you made between household size on your bar chart. She's basically saying, was that for any one individual from those households? Was that the sampling thing, or were you trying to get completes from all members eligible in the household?
That is also a very good question. The NTAS is an individual level household. So it would be the individuals who are basically invited rather than the household members. But it's a good question because the NTS is actually a household level survey that tries to collect responses from everyone in the household. So really good question. But yeah, NTAS would be person level.
Thank you. And I think this one largely relates to you, but Nicole might have something to say as well. Basically, when thinking about cost analysis, do the costs include, this is a good question, do the costs include increased chasing up time and the kind of resources that are required when you offer lower incentives? So the monetary incentive is lower, but they're basically saying, are you trying to account for all the extra chasing up that's required when you use less cash?
Yes, that is definitely a very good question. I'll have to go back exactly to like all the details that we inputted into the calculation. I think in our study, and we were definitely expecting a larger difference in terms of fieldwork efforts, what we found is that time to complete was not that dissimilar. It was 1 day faster in the 15-pound condition when compared to the 5, which is still a gain, but maybe not as pronounced as we would expect. I think definitely the fact that the NTAS is a longitudinal study might have contributed to some of those differences, and maybe in a cross-sectional setting, there might be larger differences.
Thank you. Do you have any more general thoughts on that, Nicole? This issue, this sort of false economy issue, that you could offer lower incentive, but you're just going to end up spending more person time, running around trying to get people to respond.
Yes, I think that's definitely something that's worth bearing in mind. The bigger cost, I think I would say that for us, the kind of screening is the big cost. And so that's what makes this work viable or not viable from a kind of funding body point of view. So it's the screening costs that is the overwhelming cost for targeting subpopulations rather than the chasing up time, I think.
Thank you. And one more question. Did you also consider different ways to encourage people to open letters or emails that included the information about incentivization together with the survey links? Not sure quite what's intended in terms of the email, but I suppose the letters were in the sort of stuffed envelope kind of, territory. Either of you any thoughts about that? So I take it the answer is no, you didn't consider different ways to make people.
Yeah, I don't know other than stating the incentive. Like I don't think we did anything else rather than that, but I'm definitely aware of some research that has been conducted in other countries like the US, for example, with visible cash, and how that actually impacted completion when compared to hidden cash or other aspects. So I definitely think there is a lot there. I think with e-vouchers and digital incentives, we might need to get a little creative to replicate that, if that would be of interest, but definitely an interesting avenue for further research.
Yeah, we didn't consider this either, but I think it's an interesting avenue to go down to get people to actually open the invitation letters, even as kind of the first hurdle. Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting avenue indeed, but I'm afraid we've run out of road. So it's just coming up to 1 o'clock. Thank you very much to Nicole and Eva for 2 very interesting papers. Thank you for attending and for depositing your questions. We have another seminar on February the 8th, which we hope you'll join us for. In the meantime, thank you and good afternoon.